The water was still rising when Margaret Thornfield realized her mistake. 20 years of neighborly warnings dismissed with a laugh and a wave. Now her pristine white Mercedes sat 15 feet underwater, its headlights creating an eerie glow. Beneath the surface, like the eyes of some drowned beast, the pond had claimed its prize, and as Margaret stood on the muddy bank in her designer heels, watching bubbles escape from her car's interior, she finally understood that some people aren't bluffing when they say, "I warned you." Behind her, Eleanor Blackwood stood in her doorway, arms crossed, her weathered face showing not an ounce of sympathy. The feud that had simmered for 2 decades was about to boil over, and this time there would be consequences neither woman could imagine. Eleanor Blackwood had been awake since 4:30 that morning, as she had every morning for the past 63 years. The ritual never changed. Black coffee, no sugar. Standing at her kitchen window overlooking the 3-acre pond that had been in her family for 4 generations. The water reflected the pre-dawn sky like polished obsidian, disturbed only by the occasional ripple from a base breaking the surface, or a blue heron stalking through the SHALLOWS. It was her sanctuary, her peace. Her property. The rumble of an expensive engine shattered the morning stillness. Eleanor's jaw tightened as she watched the white Mercedes-Benz S-Class navigate the narrow dirt road that skirted her pond. The same road she'd told Margaret Thornfield 100 times was not a public thoroughfare. The same road that led directly to the treacherous soft embankment, where the spring rains had been undermining the bank for weeks. A stop exactly where Eleanor knew it would done the same spot. Margaret had been parking for her morning power walks around the neighborhood. The spot Eleanor had, explicitly, repeatedly, and with increasing firmness, told her not to use. Eleanor sat down, her coffee mug with deliberate care, and stepped onto her back porch. The morning air was thick with humidity, promising another scorching Tennessee day. She could see Margaret through the Mercedes windshield, checking her appearance in the rearview mirror, adjusting her yoga pants and sports bra that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly grocery budget. Margaret. Eleanor's voice carried across the water with the authority of someone who'd spent decades commanding respect. "Get that car away from my pond." Margaret Thornfield stepped out of her vehicle with the fluid grace of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. At 45, she maintained the kind of artificial perfection that money could buy: perfectly highlighted blonde hair, strategically enhanced features, and the confident stride of a woman who'd married well and divorced better. Her athletic wore designer labels, and her running shoes were pristine white, clearly more for show than actual exercise. "Good morning to you too, Eleanor," Margaret called back, her voice carrying that particular blend of sweetness and condescension she'd perfected. "Beautiful morning for a walk, isn't it?" Eleanor descended the porch steps, her work boots finding sure footing on the familiar path. At 72, she moved with the steady purpose of someone who'd spent a lifetime working the land. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her clothes-worn jeans and a flannel shirt spoke of function over fashion. "Don't you good morning me," Eleanor said, closing the distance between them. "I've told you 20 times if I've told you once this is private property, that road is private, that parking spot is on my land." Margaret's smile never wavered, but her green eyes hardened. "Oh, Eleanor, you're being dramatic again. It's just a little patch of dirt. I'm not hurting anything. You're hurting my property rights. For starters," Eleanor gestured toward a hand-painted wooden sign that read "Private property, no trespassing" in bold red letters, and you're parked on unstable ground. That bank's been washing away since the spring floods. The ground seems perfectly solid. To me, Margaret tapped the toe of her expensive shoe against the packed earth. "Besides, I've been parking here for months without any problems. Months without my permission." Margaret's laugh was light and dismissive. "Really, Eleanor, you act like I'm camping here. I parked for 15 minutes while I get my steps in. It's not like I'm throwing wild parties or dumping trash." Eleanor felt the familiar burn of frustration in her chest. This was the problem with people like Margaret. They saw the world as their personal playground, obstacles to be charmed or bulldozed through rather than respected. It wasn't just about the parking. It was about the principle. It was about respect. It was about understanding that some things weren't for sale, weren't negotiable, weren't up for debate. "Margaret, I'm going to say this one more time, and I want you to listen carefully." Eleanor's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. "This is my land, my pond, my road. You have no right to be here, and every time you park that car in this spot, you're trespassing. The bank is unstable. The ground is soft. One of these days, you're going to regret not listening to me." For the first time, Margaret's composure cracked slightly. A flash of annoyance crossed her features before she smoothed it away. "Are you threatening me, Eleanor? I'm warning you. There's a difference, is there?" Margaret tilted her head, studying Eleanor with the calculating gaze of someone used to reading people for weaknesses. "Because it sounds to me like you're trying to intimidate me. Maybe I should call the police and report your threatening behavior." Eleanor's laugh was harsh. "Go ahead, call them. I'll show them the property survey that proves you're trespassing. I'll show them the no trespassing signs you've been ignoring. I'll show them the legal documents that establish my ownership of this road. You want to involve the law? Let's involve the law." Margaret's jaw tightened. She'd clearly expected Eleanor to back down, to defer to her implied social status and connections. When that didn't happen, her mask slipped a little further. "You know what your problem is, Eleanor. You're a bitter old woman who can't stand seeing other people enjoy life. You sit in that little house of yours, staring out at this pond like some kind of troll guarding a bridge. I feel sorry for you." "And you," Eleanor replied evenly, "are a spoiled rich woman who thinks the rules don't apply to her. But here's something you'd better understand. Money doesn't buy you the right to do whatever you want on other people's property. We'll see about that." Margaret turned back toward her car, then paused. "You know, Eleanor, I've been thinking about buying some land around here, maybe building a nice house with a view of the water. I'm sure the county would be interested in discussing zoning changes, maybe opening up some of these old private roads for public use. Wouldn't that be nice? More neighbors, more foot traffic, maybe even some development." Eleanor felt her blood pressure spike. The threat was clear, or faced the possibility of losing the isolation and privacy that made her property valuable to her. It was exactly the kind of power play she'd expected from someone like Margaret. "You do what you think you need to do," Eleanor said quietly. "But until that day comes, ever does you stave off my property." Margaret climbed into her Mercedes and started the engine. The powerful motor purred with barely contained energy, like a predator preparing to strike. She rolled down the window and leaned out, her smile returning but lacking any warmth. "See you tomorrow, Eleanor. Same time, same place." Eleanor watched the Mercedes pull away, the expensive tires spinning slightly in the soft dirt. Margaret hadn't headed toward the road that led to the main street. Instead, she'd driven to the far end of the pond, where the dirt track connected to the paved county road, the route. That gave her access to Eleanor's property in the first place. Standing alone in the growing heat of the morning, Eleanor felt the weight of decades pressing down on her shoulders. This wasn't just about parking anymore. This was about respect, about boundaries, about the fundamental question of what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object. She walked to the edge of the pond, where Margaret's car had been parked. The ground was indeed softer than it looked. Eleanor had been monitoring the erosion for weeks, watching the spring rains and the natural seepage gradually undermine the stability of the bank. She knelt and pressed her palm against the earth. It gave slightly under pressure, like a sponge barely holding its shape. A few more heavy rains, a little more saturation, a little more weight in the wrong place. Eleanor stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. She'd given Margaret fair warning, more than fair. She'd been patient, respectful, even accommodating at first, but patience had its limits, and respect had to be mutual. As she walked back toward her house, Eleanor made a mental note to check the weather forecast. Heavy rains were predicted for the weekend, the kind of soaking, sustained downpour that would saturate the ground and make the pond bank even more unstable. Margaret Thornfield wanted to keep parking there. Fine. Some lessons, Eleanor reflected, had to be learned the hard way behind her. The pond stretched calm and dark under the climbing sun, its depths holding secrets that only the most foolish would dare to test. By evening, word would spread through the small community about the confrontation between the old woman and the wealthy newcomer. People would take sides, make predictions, place bets on who would back down first. None of them would imagine that by the first drops hit Eleanor's window at 3:17 Saturday morning, fat and heavy as coins. She'd been lying awake listening to the thunder roll across the hills, watching lightning flicker behind her curtains like a broken neon sign. The weather service had been right. This wasn't going to be one of those gentle spring showers that kissed the earth and moved on. This was the kind of storm that changed landscapes. By dawn, the rain was falling in sheets, so thick Eleanor could barely see the pond from her kitchen window. The water level had already risen 6 inches, and she could hear the angry rush of the creek that fed into it from the north. Her rain gauge showed 4 inches in the first 6 hours, with no sign of letting up. She made coffee and settled into her father's old recliner, the one positioned perfectly to observe the pond through the bay window he'd installed when she was 12. He'd taught her to read the water then, how to spot the signs of change, the subtle shifts that meant the difference between safety and disaster. The pond was telling her a story now, and it wasn't a pleasant one. The rain hammered against the roof with machine gun persistence. Eleanor's phone buzzed with weather alerts, flash flood warnings, road closures, advisories to avoid low-lying areas. She scrolled through the messages with grim satisfaction. Every government agency in the county was essentially telling people to do what she'd been telling Margaret Thornfield: for months stay away from unstable banks near bodies of water at 7:30. Through the curtain of rain, Eleanor saw the familiar white shape of the Mercedes navigating the dirt road. She set down her coffee cup with enough force to rattle the saucer. "You absolute fool," she whispered. Margaret's car moved more slowly than usual, windshield wipers working frantically against the deluge. The expensive vehicle slipped and slid on the muddy track, tires struggling for purchase on the increasingly treacherous surface. But still, incredibly, stubbornly, Margaret guided it toward her usual parking spot. Eleanor grabbed her rain slicker and boots. She'd given her last neighborly warning yesterday, but she couldn't sit back and watch someone drive into what had become a death trap. No matter how infuriating that someone might be, the rain hit her like a physical blow as she stepped outside. Within seconds, her slicker was soaked through, and her boots were squelching through mud that hadn't existed the day before. The familiar path to the pond's edge had become a slip-hazard obstacle course of standing water and loose earth. Margaret was already out of her car, struggling to open a bright pink umbrella that the wind immediately inverted. She wore what looked like a designer rain outfit matching jacket and pants in a shade of yellow that probably had some pretentious name like Tuscan Sunrise. Even in a torrential downpour, she'd managed to coordinate. "Margaret!" Eleanor shouted over the thunder. "Are you out of your mind?" Margaret looked up, her perfectly styled hair now plastered to her skull. For the first time since Eleanor had known her, Margaret Thornfield looked less than composed. Her makeup was running in colorful streaks down her cheeks, and her designer rain gear clung to her body like wet paint. "I'm not letting a little weather stop my routine," Margaret called back, having to shout to be heard over the storm. "Some of us have discipline." Eleanor slogged through the mud toward her, every step confirming what she already knew: the ground was saturated to the point of instability. Her boots sank 2 inches with each step, and she could feel the earth shifting beneath her weight. "Look at the ground." Eleanor gestured wildly at the muddy quagmire around Margaret's car. "Look at the water level. This entire bank is about to give way." Margaret glanced around with the dismissive air of someone consulting a menu at a restaurant they'd already decided they didn't like. "It's just a little mud, Eleanor. The car is fine." The car is parked on what's essentially quicksand right now. Eleanor was close enough now to see the fear Margaret was trying to hide behind her stubborn defiance. "The rain has saturated the ground. The pond level is rising. That bank has been eroding for weeks, and now it's ready to collapse. You're being ridiculous." But Margaret's voice lacked its usual confidence. She glanced nervously at her Mercedes, which was indeed sitting in what had become a small lake of muddy water. Eleanor grabbed Margaret's arm, feeling the expensive fabric of her jacket beneath her work-roughened fingers. "I don't care if you listen to me about anything else, but listen to me about this. Move that car right now, or you're going to lose it." For a moment, Margaret wavered. Eleanor could see the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of pride against prudence. The smart play was obvious. Move the car. Admit the mistake. Live to fight another day. Instead, Margaret jerked her arm free. "I am so tired of you trying to control everyone and everything around here," she snapped. "You think because you've lived in this backwater forever, that makes you some kind of oracle. Well, I've got news for you, Eleanor. The world has moved on. This isn't your personal kingdom anymore. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach, not anger this time, but a kind of terrible clarity. She'd done everything she could, more than she should have, really. Some people, she realized, were determined to learn their lessons the hard way. "Fine," Eleanor said quietly, "but when this goes bad and it will go bad, don't say I didn't warn you." She turned and began slogging back toward her house, each step taking her further from the disaster she could see coming, as clearly as the lightning that split the sky above them. Behind her, Margaret called out something that was lost in the thunder, but Eleanor didn't turn around. She'd played her part in this drama. What happened next was out of her hands. Back in her kitchen, Eleanor toweled off and poured fresh coffee. Through the window, she could see Margaret beginning her power. Walk around the pond, struggling against the wind and rain like some kind of demented fitness fanatic. The woman's commitment to her routine was admirable in its way, Eleanor had to admit. Stupid, but admirable. The Mercedes sat in its usual spot, chrome gleaming wetly in the gray light. From her vantage point, Eleanor could see what Margaret apparently couldn't or wouldn't. The water was lapping at the car's tires now. Not just puddles, but the actual pond water, risen beyond its normal boundaries and creeping steadily inland. Eleanor settled back into her father's chair and waited at 8:55. She heard the first crack. It wasn't loud, more like the sound of someone stepping on a large stick, but Eleanor had grown up around this pond, had listened to its moods and voices for 7 decades. She knew the difference between the normal settling sounds of saturated earth and the warning groans of ground about to give way. Margaret was on the far side of the pond now, a tiny yellow figure bent against the storm. She wouldn't hear what Eleanor was hearing. She wouldn't see what Eleanor was seeing. The way the water around her car had begun to move, creating tiny whirlpools and eddies that spoke of hollow spaces opening beneath the surface. Another crack, louder this time. Eleanor found herself leaning forward in her chair. Coffee forgotten. The Mercedes shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight settling that could have been dismissed as the tires sinking deeper into the soft ground. But Eleanor knew better. The car wasn't sinking into the ground was sinking away from the car. At 8:52, the bank collapsed. It happened faster than Eleanor had expected, but not as dramatically as the movies might have suggested. There was no thunderous roar, no spectacular explosion of earth and water. Instead, the ground simply opened up, like a trap door that had been waiting for exactly the right moment to spring. The Mercedes dropped, nose first, into the pond with a splash that was audible even over the storm. For a moment, it bobbed like some kind of unlikely boat, its rear wheels still touching the rapidly disappearing shoreline. Then the ground behind it gave way too, and the entire vehicle slid backward into the water with the stately inevitability of a ship launching. Eleanor was on her feet, without conscious thought, pressing against the window as if she could somehow get a better view of what had just happened. The Mercedes was completely submerged now, visible only as a pale shape beneath 6 feet of muddy pond water. Its headlights were still on, creating an eerie underwater glow that reminded Eleanor of the eyes of some deep-sea creature. Across the pond, Margaret had stopped walking. Even through the rain and distance, Eleanor could see the moment when Margaret turned and realized her car was gone. The woman stood frozen for several heartbeats, her pink umbrella forgotten in her hand. Then Margaret began to run. She moved with surprising speed for someone slogging through mud in designer rain gear. But it was the desperate, uncoordinated running of someone whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed as completely as the pond bank. She slipped twice, went down hard once, and came up covered in mud, but still moving. Eleanor found herself walking to her front door, then stepping onto the porch. Not to gloat, she took no pleasure in being right about something like this, but because, despite everything, Margaret was her neighbor. And neighbors looked out for each other, even when they couldn't stand each other. Margaret reached the edge of what had been the bank, and was now a muddy cliff dropping into dark water. She stood there in the hammering rain, staring down at the submerged shape of her car, her mouth opening and closing like someone trying to scream. By Monday morning, Margaret Thornfield had transformed from a woman in shock into a force of calculated vengeance. Eleanor watched from her kitchen window as a parade of vehicles made their way down her private road, the tow truck crew who spent 3 hours winching the waterlogged Mercedes from the pond's depths. the insurance adjuster with his clipboard and camera, the county inspector who measured and photographed the collapsed bank, and finally, a black Lincoln Town Car that delivered a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. Eleanor recognized the type immediately. Margaret had brought in her lawyer. The Mercedes emerged from the pond like some primordial beast, water streaming from every crevice, interior completely flooded, engine undoubtedly destroyed. The tow truck driver shook his head as he secured it to his flatbed, and Eleanor could see him explaining to Margaret that the car was a total loss. Even from a distance, Eleanor could read Margaret's body language, rigid with fury, gestures sharp and aggressive. Her voice carrying across the water, even if her words didn't. The insurance adjuster spent considerable time at the collapsed bank, taking measurements and photographs from every angle. Eleanor had dealt with his type before, when storm damage had taken out her barn roof 5 years ago. He was documenting everything, building a case file that would determine whether this was an act of God, an accident, or negligence on someone's part. Eleanor was putting on her good boots when the knock came at her door. She opened it to find Margaret flanked by the man in the expensive suit, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of practiced smile that probably cost $500 an hour. Margaret had changed from her mud-stained designer rain gear into a charcoal business suit that screamed power and money. Her makeup was flawless again, her hair perfectly styled, but her eyes held the cold fury of someone who'd been humiliated and was determined to make someone pay for it. Eleanor Blackwood. The lawyer extended a manicured hand. "I'm Richard Castleman, representing Mrs. Thornfield. I wonder if we might have a word." Eleanor didn't take the offered hand. "I figured you'd be coming around. Might as well get it over with." She led them into her living room, the same space where she'd offered Margaret shelter during the storm. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Castleman arranging papers on the coffee table with theatrical precision. "Mrs. Blackwood," Castleman began, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to getting his way, "my client has suffered significant damages as a result of conditions on your property. We're here to discuss a reasonable settlement before this matter escalates to litigation." Eleanor looked from the lawyer to Margaret, who sat with her hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl, though her eyes burned with barely contained rage. "What kind of damages are we talking about?" Castleman consulted his papers. "The vehicle?" It was a 2024 Mercedes S-Class, valued at approximately $95,000. "Mrs. Thornfield has also incurred expenses for alternate transportation, storage fees, and of course, there's the matter of emotional distress caused by this traumatic incident." Traumatic incident. Eleanor repeated the phrase like she was tasting something unpleasant. "Is that what we're calling it when someone ignores repeated warnings and parks on unstable ground during a thunderstorm?" Margaret spoke for the first time since entering the house. "You knew that bank was dangerous. You had a legal obligation to warn people adequately." "I warned you plenty," Eleanor replied evenly. "I told you the ground was soft. I told you the bank was eroding. I told you not to park there. What part of that wasn't adequate?" Castleman leaned forward. "Mrs. Blackwood, the law requires property. There are specific statutes regarding attractive nuisances and dangerous conditions. You failed to post adequate warnings, failed to secure the area, and failed to notify authorities about the hazardous conditions." Eleanor felt a familiar anger building in her chest. Visitors. She was trespassing. "I had no trespassing signs posted. I told her personally multiple times to stave off my property. Signs that were insufficient under county code," Castleman replied smoothly. "And your verbal warnings, while noted, don't absolve you of legal responsibility for maintaining safe conditions." Margaret leaned forward, her composure cracking slightly. "You could have called the police. You could have had my car towed. You could have put up barriers or warning lights. Instead, you sat in your house and watched it happen. You wanted this to happen." Eleanor studied Margaret's face, seeing past the anger to the fear beneath. This wasn't just about money or even humiliation. Margaret's entire sense of control, her belief that wealth and determination could overcome any obstacle, had been shattered along with the pond bank. She needed someone to blame, someone to make responsible for her loss of invincibility. "You're right about one thing," Eleanor said quietly. "I could have done more to stop you. I could have called the sheriff every time you trespassed. I could have put up a fence. I could have filed for a restraining order, but I chose to trust that you were a reasonable adult who would listen to common sense. "That's negligence," Castleman declared. "Clear and actionable negligence." Eleanor turned her attention to the lawyer. "Mr. Castleman, let me ask you something. If I put up a sign that says 'Danger, thin ice,' and someone chooses to go ice skating anyway, am I responsible when they fall through? That's a false analogy, is it? Because I told your client the ground was unstable. I told her it was dangerous. I told her she was trespassing. She chose to ignore all of that because she decided she knew better. How is that my fault?" Margaret stood abruptly, her careful composure finally cracking. "Because you're a spiteful old woman who wanted to teach me a lesson. You sat there watching the storm, knowing what would happen, and you did nothing to prevent it." Eleanor remained seated, her voice calm. "Margaret, I came out in that storm to warn you one last time. I begged you to move your car. You told me to mind my own business. You could have physically prevented me from parking there. By doing what? Blockading my own property. Having you arrested? Filing harassment charges." Eleanor shook her head. "You were determined to park there no matter what I said. You made that clear every single day." Castleman cleared his throat, sensing the conversation was spiraling away from his preferred script. "Mrs. Blackwood, my client is prepared to be reasonable. We're not looking to destroy you financially. A settlement of $100,000 would cover the vehicle loss and associated damages, and we could all move on from this unfortunate incident." Eleanor felt her blood pressure spike. $100,000. Nearly twice what her entire property was worth. Money she didn't have and couldn't raise without selling the land that had been in her family for 4 generations. "And if I don't agree to your reasonable settlement," Castleman's smile grew sharper, "then we file suit in civil court. We seek punitive damages for gross negligence. We petition the county to investigate your property for code violations and public safety hazards. We explore whether this incident constitutes reckless endangerment." He paused for effect. "Legal battles can be very expensive, Mrs. Blackwood. Even when you win, you lose." The threat was clear. They had the resources for a protracted legal fight. Eleanor didn't. They could tie her up in court for years, force her to spend money she didn't have on lawyers she couldn't afford, and probably succeed in taking her property. Even if they didn't win the case, Margaret was watching Eleanor's face, looking for signs of capitulation. "You brought this on yourself, Eleanor. All you had to do was treat me with basic courtesy and respect. Instead, you chose to be vindictive and controlling. Actions have consequences." Eleanor looked at this woman sitting in her living room, making threats while demanding money for the consequences of her own stubborn stupidity, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger this time, but something colder and more dangerous. A kind of clarity that came from finally understanding exactly who she was dealing with. "Mr. Castleman," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a new edge, "I assume you've done your research on this case, background checks, property records, that sort of thing." The lawyer nodded. "Of course, standard due diligence. Then you know I'm 72 years old. I live on a fixed income, and my primary asset is this property that's been in my family since 1954. We're aware of your circumstances." "Yes," Eleanor smiled, and something in that expression made Margaret lean back slightly. "Then you also know that I have nothing left to lose." Castleman frowned. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact." Eleanor stood, moving to the window that overlooked the pond. The collapsed bank was still visible, a raw scar in the earth where Margaret's car had been swallowed. "You want to take me to court? Fine. Let's go to court. Let's put this whole story in front of a jury." She turned back to face them. "Let's talk about how your client repeatedly trespassed on posted private property. Let's discuss how she was warned, verbally and in writing, about the dangers of parking on unstable ground. Let's examine the weather reports that advised people to avoid areas near bodies of water during the storm. Let's review the timeline T.